So we're going to begin chapter 19 now. This is population ecology or growth of populations. So let's see here. Okay, so studying populations. Of course, we're familiar now with populations. We covered populations from an evolutionary perspective, and now we're going to do it with ecological perspective. So, population ecology is basically the study of the size and structure of populations and how they change over time and space. Some populations are stable, some grow really fast, especially things like bacteria and things like that. Other populations grow much more slowly, and then there are long-term trends as well. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species in a defined area. And the size of the population is just all the individuals in the population, the total number of individuals. And then population density is the number of individuals per unit area, calculated by dividing the total population size by the area of interest. So it might be per acre, per square mile, whatever. Here, let's take a look at this. Okay, so here's one population, and here's another. Okay, and this is population So, obviously, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay. Okay. No, not that. Oh. Now, so I want you to view this animation on population growth. It's under chapter 19, under animations. It says it's not very long, it's 2 minutes, and it gives you a quick overview. Okay, so let's take a look. So, what affects population size? Well, first of all, an increase or decrease depends on the number of births and deaths in the population, and individuals that enter or leave the population. Birth and immigration increase the population size. Death and emigration decrease the population size. population doubling time, the time it takes a population to double in size, good measure of how fast the population is growing. So, what other factors cause population size to change over time? Well, there's all kinds of things. Obviously, probably the first thing that comes to mind is food. So, is there enough food for the population? Is there an overabundance of food where it's not limiting? That means then that the population can continue to grow until it reaches a certain population size, which is what's called the carrying capacity. Okay, but environmental factors, so obviously space. You could have a very small area with a huge population and overcrowding, a buildup of waste, and all kinds of problems, right? So lack of space. Food is a limiting resource, is a common one. Predators can limit a population size from the top down. In other words, and if you've done Isle Royale in Symbio, you know this because you went through the whole thing with moose on Isle Royale and wolves. And before there were wolves, there were just the moose, and the moose ate themselves out of house and home. Each individual moose was generally in poor condition because they didn't really have enough to eat. There was usually a die-off every winter. And when the wolves came onto the island, they started eating the moose. And that limited the population to the point where the moose population no longer reached carrying capacity. And in other words, it was less than that. And so the moose that were left over, that were not eaten, were actually in much better, healthier condition. Okay. And the same thing with disease. Can limit a population just like predators can. We're seeing that right now with human population, perhaps. And then finally, habitat fragmentation and deterioration. So if you have let's say a rainforest in a certain area, okay, and it's an intact rainforest, a large area. And then someone goes in and starts cutting it. And so we end up with a patch taken out here. Another patch taken out here. And another patch taken out here. We now have a fragment of what it looks like. So, we still have this, but okay. So, in terms of, let's say, a mosquito population, so a mosquito population generally if it's really cold out, the population is limited. So warmer weather and also a lot wetter. Mosquitoes need to lay their eggs in water. Okay. Mosquitoes congregate and lay their eggs at water sources. Many mosquitoes prefer urban environments with trash receptacles and concentrated groups of people. That provides the mosquitoes with a host to feed on. And then environmental factors affect the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity, we've talked a little bit about it, but it's the number of individuals that can live in an environment indefinitely. In other words, there are enough resources for that population to live at that population size. If the population is below that, it can continue to grow. If the population is above that point, carrying capacity, then it will decline in size. Here we go. So let's say back here, we might as well go forward again here. Okay. So there's different kinds of population growth types. We're only going to cover two. Exponential growth. So this is the theoretical limit or of a continuously growing population, and there's no constraints on its resources. Occurs when a population increases by a constant proportion over time. Intervals such as 1 year is represented by a J-shaped growth curve. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. Okay. This is time on the bottom. Times 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then population size. Okay, we start at a low population and then it grows exponentially. Okay, that is a J-shaped curve. Okay, so J-shaped curve. Now, logistic growth. That's the growth of a population that approaches its carrying capacity because of constraint on resources. It occurs generally with nearly exponential growth in the beginning, but then stabilizes at the maximum population size that can be supported indefinitely in the environment and is represented by an S-shaped growth curve. So, again, along the bottom, time, 0, 1, 2, 3, and then the size of the population, and it starts, but there is a limit, and this is the carrying capacity. CC, and so this population, and then as it approaches, it stays at that carrying capacity, an S-shaped curve. Okay. So let's take a look. So populations can experience both. Now, a population that is not constrained by resources is in red here. And it keeps growing. The carrying capacity is right here. And logistic growth follows the same thing. It grows first slowly, then much faster, the steepness of the curve. And then as it approaches the carrying capacity, it starts to slow down and reaches that carrying capacity K. And that's logistic growth, an S-shaped curve. So mosquito larva populations constrained by the amount of standing water available, so they show logistic growth as they approach K. Adult mosquito populations have fewer environmental constraints, so they display exponential growth, but of course the females need to feed on human blood, so there is a limit. Okay. Now, a population that is constrained by a set carrying capacity will show logistic growth. Now, carrying capacity can change. Let's say carrying capacity in the wintertime, there might be much less food, and if the population is above that, it's much lower carrying capacity, and there'll be a die-off. Later, in the summer, there's an overabundance of food. If there's a high birth rate, there'll be a greater population size, and then, of course, they'll hit the winter again. So it depends. It also depends on years. Some years are much more, let's say, warmer weather and more productive with enough rain. Other years, there's a drought, might be very hot, but not enough water, and so there'll be little vegetation. So in other words, you could have a carrying capacity of 1 year, it's very high, and another year, it's very low. Okay? And then, of course, we've got your population like that, or okay. So, S-shaped curve, J-shaped curve. A J-shaped curve is a population that was growing exponentially. Obviously, a population eventually is going to hit some area, some size where its capacity to grow is limited because of a lack of resources, or it can be held below that because of, let's say, predators or disease. Okay. So which form of population growth displays a J-shaped curve, exponential growth, which an S-shaped curve? Describe a situation in which a population initially shows exponential and then logistic. Okay. So here's this again, as you can see. Okay. Human population. Now, human populations have now, because of our technology, human populations are much bigger than they were prior to agriculture. So when there was agriculture, or not agriculture, when we were hunter-gatherers, our population was limited like any other animal in terms of the amount of food that we could find. And we can see what it looked like and we've got, let's say, 160,000 years ago, actually prior to that, but the population was very low. Just about the time around here, agriculture, we start having a higher population. Okay. Let's see. Finally, we start getting actually around 1,000. There was actually a plague, and a population actually declined, and then eventually started growing. And by now, by 2050, we'll have 9.7 billion. In other words, we're still in the the logistic growth phase. There's actually a limit in how much early humans could grow. That's the carrying capacity. But because of technology, we can grow a lot more food, live in a lot more places, and so the carrying capacity, we don't know what that is. Let's say it might be up here at 10 billion people, I hope. It's getting overcrowded as it is. Okay. So human populations rise logistically with agriculture 8,000 BCE. That's before the modern era. Growth exploded exponentially with the Industrial Revolution in many parts of the world. Continues to show exponential growth to the detriment of the environment. So we are degrading the environment. The dashed line indicates the United Nations estimate carrying capacity of Earth, 9 to 10 billion people, but who knows? Okay. Oh, sorry. And then finally, so there are certain limits, things that limit a population. And they're called density dependent. In other words, the higher the density, the slower the growth, or even growth stopping or going negative, human or otherwise, can change in density dependent or density independent manner. So density dependent population change occurs when birth and deaths are affected by population density, much like the S-shaped curve. And this is resources. So the more the density, if resources are limiting in space or in food, they're going to get closer to that point carrying capacity. When many individuals occupy the same space, therefore they compete for resources, the population slows down. That is dependent on the actual size of the population. There's also density-dependent affects predation. The larger, even though predation is an external source of population, the bigger the size, the more predators grow in terms of the population of predators, and they keep the prey population below a certain size. Density-independent change occurs when population size is affected by factors that have nothing to do with the density of the population. So we'll take a look. Okay. Overcrowded conditions result in density-dependent population. So, seeds planted per square meter, average number of seeds per reproducing individual. When there's only a few seeds, then each individual plant can produce many seeds, kind of unconstrained growth per square meter. And then as the density gets to a certain point, the number of seeds that a plant can produce is limited by the resources that are available. And so there's actually, in terms of this whole area, there's kind of an equilibrium point right here. So there's a limit on how many seeds, let's say, they can produce when there's no real density, low population density. Each plant can produce, let's say, 10,000 seeds. And then it declines. Okay, so overcrowding affects many species. Oh, and what's affecting this plantain show here is a small herbaceous plant that has decreased reproduction in crowding conditions. So first of all, there's limited area, which limits the amount of sunlight that each plant can have. So as the density increases, each plant is now competing for space for sunlight. There's also probably limits on the amount of water that's available underground, and things like that. So possible factors include nutrients that might be limited, water might be limited, sunlight, and then room for root and shoot growth. Obviously, if you're really constrained. So you've probably seen, let's say, trees. Let's say you have a whole bunch of trees. Okay. So these are pine trees. Very dense, right? And the only most of the vegetation is at the very top. Okay? There's very little vegetation. It's mainly just the trunk of the trees. Okay? So there's a lot of vegetation up here. That's where the sunlight is captured, sunlight for photosynthesis. But if you've seen a pine tree that's, let's say, all by itself out in the middle of a field, what do you see? You actually see many branches. And the whole tree has a much greater area to get sunlight. Okay, now, habitat destruction results in density-dependent population change. So let's say when we went back here, let's see, fragmentation. Okay. Okay. So if a population exceeds the carrying capacity of its environment by depleting its resources, it may damage the environment. So this is reindeer, but the same thing, let's say, happened with the moose on Isle Royale. So in 1911, 25 reindeer were introduced to St. Paul Island off the coast of Alaska. Okay, so 25. Number of reindeer. As you can see, the population grew. Probably a hard year in 25, continued to grow, stopped growing, and then started a phase of exponential growth to more than 2,000 individuals. The population crashed because the reindeer at 2,000 ate up everything, overgrazed the winter food source, lowering the carrying capacity. So let's say the original carrying capacity was, let's say right here. Okay, they overshot that during the summertime. Let's say during the summertime it was all the way up here. But then, by overgrazing, they actually lowered, finally, the carrying capacity. They degraded the landscape to the point where there was now only enough food for eight reindeer to actually survive. Okay, so we see this in let's see, we have this. Here's the original carrying capacity right up here. Let's say the population, and that's during the summertime, but during the winter, actually during the summer we'll say it's up here. So we have a population that starts growing. It actually overshoots the amount of food. It reaches this, and then winter comes, and it's now carrying capacity. So it starts to crash, and it probably cycles like that, getting closer and closer. But if it's too high, and it degrades the landscape, there's finally a lower carrying capacity. Okay, from density-dependent population. Okay. So, it depletes the population, depletes the resources, may damage the environment so badly that carrying capacity is lowered. A drop in carrying capacity means habitat cannot support as many individuals. Habitat deterioration continues, results in widespread starvation and death, and the population crashes. And that's what was kind of happening with the moose until the wolves came onto the island and stopped the population from actually getting to carrying capacity. And the wolf population then increased sizes. Dependent, right, is right here. That depends on the size of the population. So let's say we had initial population, an area like this, and now we fragment it along its edges. So this is taken out, this is taken out, all this is taken out, and now we have a much smaller population. Okay, that can support less individuals. Well, okay. So, density, now we have density independent, okay, population limit. So we've got something that's limiting the population, that is limiting it so that it actually stays well below the carrying capacity. Okay. So let's say before DDT, we'll actually have this. We have a population of about up here, and then DDT is applied, and it plummets the population. And then once DDT was banned, it took a while, but then the population started growing again. And now in the United States, there's at least 10,000 breeding pairs, but there is, of course, a limit on how much food there is. Okay. So, DDT poisoning directly responsible for the eagle decline. It causes eggshell thinning, and the eggshells break easily, and then there's no babies. The early 60s, only 417 breeding pairs remained. This was a huge drop from 100,000 breeding pairs present in 1800. That's estimated, and populations increased dramatically after DDT was banned. And that had far-reaching effects in the population. In fact, I'll give you an example. So, bald eagles are mainly fish eagles. And they get salmon, they get other fish from the ocean, they actually grab them up flying over and pull fish out of the water and eat them. Okay. So, these eagles, of course, raise their young. Usually they're found near water, whether it's lakes or rivers or the ocean. Okay. If you go out to the Channel Islands, there were, at one point, many, there were bald eagles all over, let's say, Santa Cruz Island and Santa Rosa Island and all that. Okay. Then DDT was used, right? And the bald eagle population declined substantially. When there were no bald eagles, what showed up were golden eagles from the coast. So golden eagles were excluded by bald eagles, but there's no more bald eagles. So the golden eagles came over to the islands, and on the islands were pigs and all kinds of things, but there were also these little island foxes that are still there, and they were getting eaten by the golden eagles, and they became heavily endangered. The bald eagles didn't eat those island foxes. The golden eagles did, and the foxes on the island had this condition called tameness, which happens on a lot of isolated populations on islands where there's no other predators around, and so they lose their fear of anything, and so they were easy pickings for golden eagles. Fortunately, the eagle population, bald eagles were reintroduced, and the population expanded, and finally now they started chasing away the golden eagles, and the island foxes have made a rebound. Okay. Now, population, sometimes there's unpredictable population change. Sometimes you have irregular fluctuations in population size. Populations of many species rise and fall unpredictably. So, this is here. It's better, let's say, Okay. Brazil mounted a massive anti-mosquito campaign to combat yellow fever. Okay, the population of mosquitoes went way down. Okay, so we had a population of mosquitoes and it declined. Okay. Disease also transmitted by yellow fever, by these mosquitoes, also declined. They spraying insecticides, removing standing water. Officials declared 1958 the Aedes aegypti had been eradicated. Very low population size. Okay. By the 70s, the mosquitoes started, instead of keeping the campaign going to a maintenance level, they stopped it. And so the population of the mosquitoes increased, and yellow fever increased. And now, an unwelcome irregular fluctuation, so the population of mosquitoes was all over the place. Okay, there we go. Now, you can also have a situation where you have cyclical fluctuations, predictable population rise and fall. And this can happen, of course, over the year. So, let's say every year we go up in the summertime, down in the winter, up in the summertime, down in the winter, up in the summertime, down in the winter, like that. Or, in this case, there's something else that's keeping the population cycling, and that's the lynx. So we have these snowshoe hares that the lynx feed on. Bunnies, of course, breed like rabbits, and their population sizes can explode. So, and then there's seasonal changes in temperature. So that's what I just showed you occur but also when two species strongly are influenced by each other. In other words, like cheetahs and gazelles, the population size of the gazelles is kept low by cheetahs. Cheetahs grow to a certain population size based on how many gazelles there are. If cheetahs overshoot, they get the gazelles down too low, their population goes down as well. So, Canadian lynx depend on snowshoe hare for food, so the lynx populations increase when the hare populations rise, and they decrease when the hare populations drop. The population cycles are also density-dependent population changes because each population is affected by the other, and they cycle together in response to each other's density. And we'll take a look at see what that looks like. Okay. So, first of all, lynx hare populations, and you can see right all the way along that. And if you notice, so this peak right here is a little bit off compared to the peak right here. Why? Well, the hare population rises to a certain point, and then the lynx, it takes a while for the lynx to breed, and their population starts to rise. And then, of course, there's a population crash by too many lynx that eat up all the bunny rabbits, and so on. So the number of lynx rises and falls with the number of hares, but at a slightly lagged time, like here, compared to here. Again, here, compared to here. Okay. Okay, and then finally, so remember, before our current epidemic, we had, you heard about Zika virus, which was circulating in the tropics, especially the neotropics, Brazil, Colombia, all that, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, all that. And Zika is a vector-borne disease. That means a vector-borne is that infection is caused by an intermediate host that carries the bacteria or the virus from one individual to another. So, namely, let's say, here's a mosquito. It bites someone who has Zika. It picks it up. It then flies along and bites someone else and transfers that virus in that person. And most people don't even get sick or anything from Zika. But, unfortunately, Zika has huge effects on neonates, embryos that are growing inside the mother when she's pregnant. Okay? And specifically, it infects the neural tissue of the brain. And so it causes massive changes, much smaller brain, all kinds of problems, obviously, massive retardation. A lot of babies don't survive. And so they were looking for a way to perhaps control the outbreak of Zika virus. And they did this by genetically engineering some Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, specifically males that were sterile. Okay, so Zika, here's the actual virus. You can see this inside tissue with a brown particle with a dense core packed with RNA. It's another RNA virus. There's a number of different kinds of RNA viruses, like COVID-19 is also an RNA. It looks like it was first found in Uganda and Africa. And the first human cases of Zika were detected, it was probably there beforehand, in Uganda in 1952. It then spread across Central Asia, the South Pacific. So in other words, probably it was carried in ships with water and mosquitoes in them and a mosquito larva. And it spread across all over the South Pacific, South and Central America, and the Caribbean. It actually made it to the United States. Miami, of course, is limited. It can't really go very far up the United States because of a limit on where the mosquitoes can live. So it usually causes a very mild sickness in adults, or no sickness at all, lasts less than a week, fever, red eyes, headache. But unfortunately, it stunts the brain growth of unborn babies infected with their mother. So this is in fact a Zika baby, and most of them die. So you can see where Aedes, the range of Aedes aegypti is the southern United States from California all the way across, depending on also on time of year. And so there was a question of whether Zika was going to actually enter the United States, but it really didn't. There were a few cases of Zika in Florida and Alabama and I think Texas and certainly in Puerto Rico, but that was about it. So officials confirmed the first known case of Zika being transmitted by mosquitoes in the United States in July 29th, 2016. Okay. So, Zika is spread by the females of both Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus species. Related, they both serve as vectors, so vector-borne disease carriers for dengue, chikungunya, and other viruses, including Zika, yellow fever, all kinds of things. The female mosquitoes are the only ones that get blood and meals so that they can produce eggs. They feed on human blood. The viral particles are taken up in the mosquito saliva and then can be transferred over to another human when they're bitten. The virus is able to invade skin cells and spread to lymph nodes and bloodstream. Male mosquitoes do not drink blood. Zika can spread from person to person via body fluids, but mainly from mosquitoes. But it looks like semen, there was some evidence of Zika being transferred as a sexually transmitted disease among partners, but not really all that much. Okay. So a person is bitten, the mosquito becomes infected, goes inside, will often live in a single house during its lifetime, will bite these individuals, produce more mosquitoes, more in the community, and so on. And then less common ways during pregnancy, through sex, or blood transfusion. Okay. Obviously, you can use insecticides on mosquitoes, and that's what they did. But they were looking for perhaps a better way. Insecticides kill all kinds of other insects besides mosquitoes, beneficial insects that actually, insects that pollinate crops. And it turns out actually also that mosquitoes, the females drink blood, but they don't drink blood all the time. Mosquitoes also pollinate plants as well. Most people don't know that. So they were looking for maybe altering the mosquitoes so that it makes a population crash. Altering the genes of an organism for a specific purpose, this is genetic modification. Okay. And in this case, it only kills targeted mosquitoes. So, insert a single gene into mosquitoes that produces a protein that blocks the maturation of larva to adult. In the lab, this maturation blocking protein is blocked itself so that the mosquitoes can become adults. Only males are released into the wild. The male GM mosquitoes mate with wild females and produce offspring with a lethal gene the offspring die because they can't mature, and the size of the population is reduced. They use something called a daisy chain, where it's actually a number of different blocks during the life cycle. So if, because you don't want mosquitoes actually transferring this on down, and it actually line, because you can end up having what's called evolution in the mosquito cycle. So infected female mosquito mates with male. Female lays eggs that carry Zika virus and RGM. Eggs hatch, and infected larvae. Larvae die. No infected pupa survive. No infected adults. Normally, during the breeding cycle, infected females, mosquitoes mate with normal male, lays eggs, eggs hatch, larvae develop, and so on. Okay. So they developed this mosquito, released mosquitoes, reduced the wild population of Aedes aegypti by 85%. In 2013, released the mosquito, reduced the wild population by 96%. So it worked. And they made sure that you don't want this actually being released, like the males actually transferring it and it getting into a wild population. So it's designed not to. So why don't we do these mosquitoes? Well, it's expensive, obviously. Biotechnology. What if the engineered gene won't correctly insert into the genome or becomes activated? Some reject the plant solely on grounds it's genetically modified. It remains too soon to tell whether GM mosquitoes will stop the spread of Zika. Success will depend on the population ecology. History suggests the fight against mosquitoes. Time to try something new. Okay. And that's it. I'm going to ask some questions, or one question, so make sure you do that.